Hola y bienvenidos.
Olá, olá, bem-vindos.
Hello and welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion Forum at the Biodiversity Genomics 2020 meeting.
I am Marcela. I am a senior bioinformatician at the Sanger Institute. I work in the Darwin Tree of Life project and also with the VGP assembling and analyzing genomes. I have a PhD from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I am Brazilian and Italian. And during my PhD, I started to get involved in science communication to engage society in the discussion and to fight stereotypes in science as being a woman in science. I also am a TED Fellow and have been working together with my TED Fellow colleagues to fight stereotypes in science. Welcome.
My name is Sadie. I am Latina from the United States of America and the Dominican Republic. I work at the Rockefeller University in New York City in the Neurogenetics of Language Laboratory with Dr. Eric Jarvis and with the Vertebrate Genomes Project. My background is as a biomechanist and a physiotherapist with a focus on global public health. My current role focuses on translating our science from the bench to the public, both in the work itself as well as in how we communicate and outreach to others.
We are your co-chairs today, and we will be joined by a wonderful panel that you will soon meet.
The purpose of this forum is to open a dialogue within this community about the challenges in dismantling inequalities, racial, gender, age, in our communications and collaborations with Indigenous people, and other inequalities that persist in our science. We will also engage in reflections on how we as individuals and as a community can be truly equitable in our behaviors, how to make our data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and how to be better in our science through exploring diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice opportunities.
So we know that most inequalities are ingrained in society, so the challenge of ending them is enormous. But us as scientists, they are privileged people just for having the opportunity to be educated in this everyday, more unequal world, have to put our heads together to think how we can minimize these inequalities in our scientific practice every day. What are the glass ceilings that remain? What are our biases? Is genomics reaching developing countries? And if not, what are we doing to help? Is genomics for all? The field of genomics has transformed over the past few decades with decreasing in sequencing costs and advances in sequencing technologies. During this time, our study of the molecular biology has reaffirmed undoubtedly the theory of evolution by common descent. In plain and simple terms, guys, we are all related, so it's only fair that we are all involved in this. Paraphrasing one of our amazing panelists on Twitter this morning, thank God, I do hope that decades from now, we should look back at this genomic era with hope and confidence. Not only that we sequence all life forms on Earth, but that people who don't look like us, younger generations, most vulnerable, indigenous community, have all benefited equally from this genomic revolution.
Many issues that impact us as humans have been amplified this year. Coronavirus has highlighted inequalities based on social and economic status. The death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor with the Black Lives Matter movement has brought renewed awareness to racial injustices. The recent death of American Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the first Jewish and only the second woman on this court, has reminded us of efforts to dismantle gender inequality. And the landmark ruling protecting LGBTQ workers has highlighted that discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation is another facet of protecting all humans as one race. Today, we will engage in the first of an ongoing conversation towards creating an equitable society in our genomics community. We hope to have an honest and candid conversation and ask that you join us by writing your questions below in the chat box. We would like to remind you that these conversations can be challenging and that being uncomfortable is not always a bad thing. We invite you to sit with us during this time as we create space to listen respectively to the lived experiences of our panelists and to consider how we as a community can move forward to be better.
So now we will briefly hear from our panelists. So each of them have a 4-minute talk, and then we will move to the Q&A sessions. They will introduce themselves in their talk, Today, as a panel, we range from PhD students to chief scientists, from working with microbes to plants to large vertebrates, from forensics to bioinformatics to public health, from Nigeria, New Zealand, Brazil, Dominican Republic, United States, Tanzania, and Australia. So now please hear our panelists, and please prepare your questions because we're going to have time for questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anne. I'm a sandwich PhD student registered at SLU in Sweden, but I do a large part of my research at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. My main research concerns soil microbiome and how that interacts with plants and what that means for plant protection and productivity. I'm also an assistant lecturer at University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and I engage with different platforms such as the Next Ancient Forum and eLife as an ambassador through further causes such as diversity and inclusion outside of academia. So today I'd like to share my perspective and experiences with diversity and inclusion in the scientific community. And I'll begin with what does diversity and inclusion mean for me? For me, it means constructing teams in scientific communities that reflect the society in which they belong. That can be at the level of an institution or regional or country-wise or global, especially now in this interconnected world. It also means respecting, appreciating, and valuing people's differences within those scientific communities. So, and recently, diversity and inclusion topics have become more mainstream, especially on social media, such as on Twitter. But I have observed that not enough is being done in real life. I've also observed the differences in the discussion around diversity and inclusion in different geographical locations. Being a student in Europe and in East Africa context, for example, I see stark differences in how diversity and inclusion matters are discussed or how they're implemented. I also would like to share about personal experiences, negative personal experiences regarding diversity and inclusion. So being a female Black African, there are lots of generalizations and assumptions just because of how I look. So people tend to assume what I can or cannot do, where I belong or do not belong. This leads to a lot of patronization in terms of people trying to show me how I can do step by step, even in fields where I'm an expert. Also, this leads to a lot of expectations on how I should behave as a female scientist, on what I can achieve, or questions like how are you going to balance family life and being a PhD student or an academician and things like that. So there's negative experiences regarding diversity and inclusion. But there's a lot we can do as individuals or scientific community. I think one of the first things to do is to address inequalities that may lead to lack of diversity or lack of inclusion of different groups of people, such as inequalities in the resources, such as funding for scientific research. But also we should continue to speak about these issues, creating awareness, but we also have to keep in mind different social, cultural backgrounds and perspectives that people bring. The most important thing for me is to induce and push for changes at systemic level. So institutional, regional, community-wide or global changes, this will help to eliminate sources and settings that lead to exclusion. This could mean changes in policies or for more diverse groups of scientists. And last, I'd like us to reflect on how we can promote sustainable diversity and inclusion practices and what are the important future actions we as individuals or scientific communities can take. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thank God, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to the Diversity and Inclusion section of the Biodiversity Genomics conference. I am a bioinformatician at the European Bioinformatics Institute, and I grew up in Nigeria. And I did my undergrad in Nigeria. I did my master's in Nigeria, and I did my PhD in Cambridge in biochemistry, and I did a visiting academic program at the University of Oxford, and I did my postdoc at the Elam Institute. I currently am helping to support the initiation of two networks, the DAISY network and the Igluna International network, alongside other networks I've been able to support or help to initiate in the past. And in this diversity and inclusion section, I'm going to engage this conversation from the perspective of the two current networks that I'm helping to initiate myself and other colleagues mainly. So, and as part of the process, I've been asked to engage this conversation from the perspective of these experiences and mainly trying to understand the perception of the community's engagement with diversity and inclusion. And from my experience, I think that the community is open to the issues of diversity in terms of engaging it. I say this particularly due to the support we've received so far in the attempt to actually set up the Africa Biogenome Initiative, and also due to the fact that this community provides a forum to link up underrepresented communities, just as those in LIMICs, lower and middle income countries, and also other communities such as the Igluna International Network that are currently emerging. So, and the next point for me is mainly what challenges are there for the field of genomics to be truly equitable. I actually think that we need to center the community, the focus on communities in terms of genomic priorities, rather than having to kind of focus on organisms, because there are several communities that are working on very cool organisms, but then they do not have the kind of leverage in terms of sequencing. So I think at this point, in order to be truly equitable, it might be helpful to begin to focus on communities who are working on specific kind of organisms. And more importantly, how do we begin to target all genders and children, and particularly ensuring that what we do, the science we do, impact them positively and is truly beneficial to them. And more particularly, how do we carry along the countries in the global south in terms of the technologies that are emerging from the series of genomic projects, and particularly how do we ensure that they're able to participate in some of the meetings and projects with minimal reliance on electricity and strong internet access. Again, the last point will have to do with the political will in some of these countries. But as scientists, the question is, what can we do in terms of making this a bit easier? So in the short and long term, what are the solutions? I think that currently we may aim to encourage sequencing efforts around communities and support the communities that are working on those systems. And also we need to engage the conversation for access to genomic and bioinformatics capacity that has minimal reliance on electricity and internet access. Again, that might be challenging because there might be lots of things around that, because it also depends on the policies in many of these countries. But how do we begin to think about that in terms of having mobile systems that allow scientists in those locations in the field to be able to access these resources? And as individuals, what role do we have to play? And one of the things I think is that we should aim to capture diversity and inclusion issues from the project conception rather up to the completion, and also rally members of our institutes, and when we aim to do this, more particularly engage this conversation at the individual and institute level. So finally, what is the most important future actions or question for us to consider as individual? Again, one of the things I think is the most important in terms of community participation will be the availability of genomic-based knowledge and sharing in synthetic forms that does not require or that requires minimal reliance on electricity and internet. Again, that is a bit challenging. How do we do that for countries in lower and middle income regions, basically? So I think for me, that is my view on the diversity and inclusion questions regarding to this. Thank you.
Hello everyone. First, I'd like to thank the opportunity to be here. And just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Amanda. I'm a biologist and currently I'm a postdoc in the Oceanographic Institute in the University of São Paulo here in Brazil. And I've been working on microbiology in extreme environments using metagenomics and bioinformatics too. But today I will talk to you about my involvement with science outreach, especially with projects involving children, girls, and special kids using science as a tool of inspiration. So first, how I got involved in this project of science outreach. And when I was in my PhD, I performed a crowdfunding to attend a course about astrobiology. Then I started to receive a lot of messages in the social media, mainly from young people and girls, saying how they were inspired by my research. Then I figured out how people are really interested in learning about science. Then I asked myself how to be more involved with the science communication. What are the short and long-term solutions now available for this? So I'll show to you some projects I have been involved with. One of these projects is the Dive into Science. There is a project with the aim of inspiring girls from 10 to 14 years with different social classes through lectures with women scientists from different areas and with practical classes in the lab. So through the course, we saw a growing of confidence of these girls, and it's really amazing. And of course, was recognized by the ONU as an example of an initiative in the universities around the world. We also performed other projects inside our university as exhibitions open to the public and also science clubs for high school students. But we also performed other projects inside the schools. Here we have an example of the International Polar Week. That is an initiative promoted by APEX. There is the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And in this event, I gave a lecture for a school with special kids such as deaf and autistic, and it was an amazing and a very inspiring experience. In other projects, we aimed to make some actions in the streets, mainly with the representation of women scientists, talking about the research to the public passing in the streets in different regions here in Brazil, such as in Rio de Janeiro and in São Paulo. And other projects we have been involved in events outside the university, for example, the Plant of Science, and also some technology and science fairs here in our city, and also other projects outside our university. So what are our challenges now? So we have some challenges, for example, of course, we have the challenge of the financial support to maintain these activities and also to perform new activities. And other challenge we have is how to get more scientists and students and people from the community more involved with our project. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Tēnei te ruru te kaukau nei, ki hai māhititi, ki hai mārakaraka, ko te upoko nui o te ruru te rekau. He pō, he ao, kāwatea, o ti hei, mauri ora. Kia ora everyone, my name is Levi Collier Robinson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Canterbury here in New Zealand, and today I'll be presenting on realising shared benefits for genomic research of species that are culturally significant to Indigenous peoples both here in New Zealand and internationally. Opportunities to explore diverse evolutionary and ecological questions continue to capture interest in unique species, often treasured by Indigenous peoples. International agreements such as the Nagoya Protocol provide a clear mandate for genomic research to prioritise Indigenous sovereignty and realise shared benefits. Combined with existing scholarship on human genomic research, there is every opportunity to extend these considerations to genomic research of culturally significant species. Yet few studies that involve genomic data of species treasured by Indigenous peoples use participatory approaches to actually co-create research. Here I would like to challenge the genomics research community to approach the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and knowledge with the same level of academic rigour brought to Western science. As a Māori researcher, I am privileged to work in partnership on such treasured species, and I would like to highlight 3 key considerations for any researcher, reviewer, editor, or publisher engaging with genomic data of culturally significant species. Firstly, partnership. Here in New Zealand, diverse tribal groups assert their authority across widely distributed treasured species, and researchers need to find ways to acknowledge diverse interests, promote relevant Indigenous voices, and recognise tribal authority when working on these species. Further, the attribution to all relevant peoples will reduce the risk of future researchers misappropriating data and thus inadvertently deepening inequities that are the result of colonisation. Secondly, benefit sharing. Genuine partnerships with Indigenous peoples leads to more resilient biological and cultural systems by bringing together diverse ways of knowing and seeing the world. For example, weaving Indigenous knowledge systems with genomic data enables more nuanced ecological and evolutionary insights and tangible conservation outcomes for culturally significant species. These benefits should extend in both directions, including enhanced capability and capacity for Indigenous peoples to realise biocultural aspirations. And finally, Indigenous data sovereignty. The risks of making genomic data publicly available have been explored extensively in the literature, including the intergenerational impact of naive and deliberate biopiracy of culturally significant plants, animals, and traditional knowledge. In response, researchers are actively co-developing ways to protect culturally significant genomic data and traditional knowledge while remaining responsive to open access culture. International initiatives such as the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance seek to ensure rights and interests in genomic data are upheld through responsible, ethical, and collectively beneficial data governance. So in summary, as researchers, we should provide evidence of how genomic data are used to enhance stewardship of culturally significant species and to enable the realization of culture, language, and practices for future generations, while appropriately acknowledging all relevant Indigenous peoples within our manuscripts. As reviewers, beyond clearly acknowledging the limits of our expertise, we should commit to improving our understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems to increase our collective ability to recognise and challenge genomic research of culturally significant species that lacks meaningful engagement. As editors, it is our responsibility to ensure reviewers collectively have the expertise necessary to assess all aspects of submitted manuscripts. Editorial decisions, including whether to publish or not, should rest with co-editorial teams that include Indigenous scholars. And we urge publishers to co-develop approaches that will encourage culturally responsive best practice, such as sections in manuscripts for researchers to provide evidence of meaningful partnership, benefit sharing, and Indigenous data sovereignty. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm the Chief Scientist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I've been in this role as a science leader for about 7 months now, so a very interesting time to take on a new role in a new country. I was previously the Chief Scientist at the Australian Museum and also a genomicist, so I would say that I've been in a science leadership role for probably about 10 years now, also balancing science. And it's a real privilege to be invited to be part of this panel to discuss diversity and inclusion, and something that I'm very passionate about myself. As a community, how do we engage with diversity and inclusion? I would say that my observation is we're making efforts, we are committed to this, but probably they've been quite slow. And if the last 6 months have shown us anything, the opportunity, there is a real opportunity to change. There's an opportunity to change the way that we do things as individuals, as a community, and also through our organisations. Don't underestimate your influence as a member of an organisation that does science. And of course, we're seeing the emergence of recognition of the importance of traditional knowledge. And I know that there are even some presentations in the conference this week, which is really exciting. The traditional knowledge is something that we know has been available for tens of thousands of years in some cases, and it adds a critical extra dimension to how we understand things and how we can interpret things as scientists, which diversity is really what we embrace, particularly in our world. If we're to be truly equitable, what are our challenges? I would answer this, there are many, of course, but I would say change is really what we're talking about here, and that can be painful and it can be challenging. It can also be challenging to commit to that change. We talk about it a lot, but actually changing our actions it takes a real effort, but the opportunity and the potential for improvement by embracing diversity and inclusion is a really exciting one for our community. I'm not going to go into some solutions in the couple of minutes that I have here, but I hope to learn many solutions through the discussion and the Q&A and through sharing my experiences and hearing others. Of course, there are things that we can do as individuals. We can do them right now. One example would be that if you refer to your white colleagues or your white male colleagues by their title, then be very conscious of doing that for other colleagues, for your female colleagues or colleagues of colour. These are unconscious things that start very early, and I see personally a lot, and I catch myself doing that a lot. So there are ways that we can embrace change immediately for ourselves, and of course through our institutions, perhaps through discussing if diversity and inclusion is a value that's going to guide decisions that you make. And I think we're going to have a bit of discussion about that on the panel. Anything short-term or long-term requires commitment, but short-term can start today. Long-term requires changing the way that we think and committing to it. If there's one thing that you could do, what would it be? Again, I'm going to leave this open so that we can have a discussion about it on the panel. But really, I think the concept of diversity and inclusion, making people feel included, is that it's time to do something different, if not a few things differently. And that is going to benefit all of us, not only our community, not only people that will feel welcome in our community and supported in our community, but also the science that comes out of it. The more diverse, the more perspectives, the more opinions, the better the outputs and the quality of what we do. Thanks again for having me as part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Hey, I really want to thank you, all of the panelists, for this very good talks. And we do have time, guys, for discussion. So please bring your questions. I want to thank Annette, thank God, Levi, Amanda, and Rebecca for sharing all of these perceptions. And all right, so let's start with some questions that we have here. So to thank God, does encourage sequence efforts around communities encompass ecological, scientific communities, or both? What is the best way to do this?
So I'm going to respond to the question. Thanks for the question. I'm going to respond to it from a different perspective, mainly from experience. And I would say basically it's both, because so far over the past several years, the focus has been on maybe model systems, maybe biological systems that we kind of are aware about. But in some of these communities, for instance, in Africa, in developing nations, there are some species that are not so well known, but then they also have huge socioeconomic importance, in those places. So let me give an example. I worked on Bostricus africanus. So it is not a well-known species, but when you go around the Gulf of Guinea, West Africa area, it's very popular. So the question is, how do we begin to focus around maybe communities that are working on those things? While it's also good to look at the model systems, it would be nice to look at the communities that basically benefit from some of these other biological systems that are not so well known. And I think by doing that, we'll also be able to ensure that there's equitable benefit from genomic resources. And from that example, if we're able to do that, then how do we begin to contribute in terms of genomic technology and things around that space for those communities?
Yeah, no, I do agree. That sounds very, very reasonable. It's a good perspective to have. So how do you think, thank God, because as Oli is saying here, a challenge will be how to immediately overcome the unequal distribution of access to know-how and technology. So do you have any insights how we should, so for example, Africa seems to always lag behind in terms of technology and advances in science. What can we do to ensure the Africans are not left behind and are included?
Okay.
It's a very big challenge, right? I mean, it's many countries, many different situations, and
yeah. So for me, one of the things I've actually proposed and is mainly because in Africa, when you have systems that are mobile, they tend to be very beneficial to the community. Based on my experience, I mean, others might have a different view. So for instance, when you have when you're sequencing genomes and you have the mobile systems, it's very easy. I would just use for instance, the telecommunication. By the time we got to the point where everyone was able to actually have mobile phones, then things began to, people began to have access to telecommunications and then begin to have access to, making transactions online via text messages and things like that. So one of the things I've proposed is how do we begin to make some of these things accessible through mobile means, mobile, for instance, sequencing platform, mobile, and in terms of, I've also proposed things in the past in trying to access some of these databases. For instance, how do we ensure that some of these pages don't require so much internet or strong internet access to be able to load them? Because when you go to some of these countries, I'm helping to initiate 2 networks, and in the past I also set up one in my alma mater and also support the Nigerian network. I communicate with some of these students and researchers and scientists via WhatsApp. And it's also very challenging to kind of connect to some of these things. But if you're able to load some of these things whereby some part of this database or wherever in the data don't really require strong internet access, then it may really go a long way to actually helping this community. But I do know that some of this data is not actually possible. But what can we do as scientists in trying to ensure that they require minimal internet access and also electricity? It's going to be a challenge, particularly.
Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of speaking about research capacity, which I think is what you're getting at a little bit, thank God, a question that we had that is a good follow-up to that one for the panel is how do we support infrastructure and trainings to increase research capacity? So I think kind of thinking about it across the board, and a follow-up with that is whether or not this is something that should be prioritized in grants. So I don't know, Rebecca, would you like to take the first response to this question?
Yeah, I think it's a really thoughtful question, and it's a big question because, and I'd really like to hear from the people on the panel that do research in country. Through my own experiences, piling a bunch of money and resources in country, if it's not actually what's needed, is not a great solution. It risks causing more problems. So I think the message that I really got from hearing the different presentations was these things take time and you have to be prepared to do things differently. So if WhatsApp is the best way to communicate with researchers in country and connect with people to find out what they actually need, we as Western scientists need to take a step back and realize that it's a two-way conversation. Probably more than 2 ways. If you're working with collaborators, you need to hear what they're saying and what they need. And that, in my experience, requires listening and probably going slower than we like to in the genomics world. We're always worried about being scooped, or we're worried about not getting the most value out of our research. But in my experience, it does require going slower and making sure that those connections are made. The kind of things that Levi was talking about obviously take a really long time to have a genuine conversation to figure out what is going to be the most meaningful outcome to both parties. And to me, that's kind of what we're talking about. And infrastructure is clearly a really, really, really important part of that. But is it actually what's needed in country at the time, or are they other things that we need?
Mm-hmm. Levi or Annette, do either one of you want to add anything to that? I thought of both of you immediately as Rebecca was sharing her thoughts.
Yeah, I can chip in a bit. Yeah, so I think we start with us as scientists, but also funders and other funding agencies in being intentional when evaluating studies for funding, when allocating funding for different research goals. As I noted, nowadays, many global issues are truly global. What affects people in Africa or the environment in Africa eventually will come and reach everybody else, as we have seen from COVID-19. So I think it starts with being intentional that there are inequalities, and we need to address these inequalities in terms of human capacity and infrastructure. So that's the first point. And as other speakers have noted, it does take time and effort and probably a bit more resources. They think it is totally worth it. But also it's important to note the differences in social cultural background, differences in resources, differences in settings and mindset. So there are challenges in the African context, say, let's say power cuts or internet. But I think with the decentralization of the technology, especially sequencing technology, becoming more portable, demanding less centralization, it is possible if you are intentional and mindful to actually do high-quality research in low resource settings. So it's also up to scientists and collaborators to actually look at actual context and what is needed in this context, and try to leave the mindset of how this is how things work. Leave it out somewhere and then see what is actually needed in a specific context. That would be my opinion.
Thank you, Annette. You brought up hybrid research. And so I want to direct this next question to Levi, given his work. So a question that came in is a challenge that we immediately sort of have to think about overcoming is the unequal distribution of access to knowledge and technology. So Levi, I'd like to direct that question to you. Thoughts on sort of how we overcome this challenge of access to information, access to technology, and the unequal distribution that we currently have in place?
I think that's a pretty huge question that probably goes well beyond my experience. But what I will say is that I think it is all about taking the time to actually address it, not just saying, oh, it's too hard, or oh, we don't have the resources. Actually making sure that we put aside the resources to go towards that, and actually actively thinking about these kind of inequities that pop up. I mean, they exist throughout society, and genomics research is no different. So yeah, all I'd say is along the same theme as what Rebecca was just touching on, is it takes time to actually do it, but you have to quite actively go and seek out the right solutions rather than just skimming over because, oh, no one else has figured it out yet.
What do you think, if you could, with your experience with Indigenous peoples, what would you suggest sort of as a first step to participatory research? So you brought up in your presentation that is something we don't do enough as a genomics community. So if you could give just sort of a first inroad for someone who might want to try to do this, what would you recommend?
Well, it's kind of a tricky one to answer because I have the privilege of walking in both worlds where, for me, it's go ask the aunties what they think, or, whatever. But for other Western scientists coming in, that's not exactly how it goes down. But I think it's all about building those relationships, building the trust. There's been generations of mistrust that's built up with Western researchers for who knows what. But regardless of the intention of us as Western scientists, it's about the impact that our research has. How can we make sure that we are having the right impact and it's beneficial to all parties? And it's not just a continually extractive process where we as academics are getting to publish in these journals and getting information out there. How are we bringing that back to these communities that we're working with that I know for a fact, my aunties and uncles aren't reading Nature or Science. Those publications mean nothing to them. How are we actually bringing that back as well, and actively impacting these communities that we're supposedly working with?
Levi, just a follow-up in this matter. Do you have an example of a disagreement between a community and a Western scientific group that you have handled well, or that you have heard of that was handled well? Or bad?
I'm sure there are several examples of that going poorly. I think
because the communication is the key, right? The process.
It is all about communication. In my experience, we haven't had any significant disagreements. It's the way we've approached all of our work has been to present what we know, present the possible outcomes of what we're doing, and say, okay, what's the best thing for us to do moving forward? How can we best approach this? For example, when we're thinking about sequencing, where are we sequencing our data? Some tribes here in New Zealand, they don't want to send any of the tissue overseas. They don't want to send any DNA overseas. They want it all done here. They want to make sure that they've got that. For us, we actually did do our sequencing overseas because we had that conversation and we said, okay, these are the benefits. These are what's happening. This is how the data is managed. And so it's not so much about, we disagree on this thing, so we don't do it, but it's about being flexible with your options. If, for example, they said, no, we don't want it going overseas. Okay, well, what are our options moving forward? You don't have to, reinvent the entire project because you disagree on one thing, but I think being flexible and understanding the concerns that people might have is key to overcoming any challenges and disagreements that you might have.
For sure.
Great. I'd like to direct this next question to Amanda and to get us started. And it's thinking about the pipeline, the STEM pipeline, and how do we get underrepresented minorities interested in genomics? And the more general question was about how do we get people interested in adopting genomics? So it's the cost as it is now, as low as it is, it's still costly. And so more specifically thinking about in low-income countries, this might be a lower priority, but this question of how do we get people interested in adopting genomics and interested in genomics overall as a science?
So it's a good question. So first, I think for my experience that in these activities we are performing in different kind of institutions, for example, inside the university or in the streets, we are aiming different kinds of publics. For example, with this course inside the university for children, we can see we are doing some research about the perception of these children before and after these activities and these studies. And we are thinking that this, for example, one day of activity really changes the way these people think about science in general, but also about genomics. So I think that if we could perform more activities for different publics, not only inside the university, but also in the streets, because in the streets we aim other kinds of publics. For example, they are not looking for a science activity directly. They are just passing in the streets, and we can bring some materials to get their attention, and then they are get interested with these materials, and then they are we can see that they getting more curious with these materials and these activities. So I think that the different kind of activities, not only inside the university, but inside the schools, in the streets, we can see, at least here in Brazil, we can see a lot of changes in this interest of people in genomics and science in general.
Thank you, Amanda. So I hear that from your experience and all of your work with the youth and trying to promote science and genomics in general, just introducing them to the idea and the concepts is enough to sometimes pique their interest. But another follow-up question that we had was further down the pipeline, was thinking about once they've entered, underrepresented minorities have entered the field of genomics and are working within faculty positions or trying to get into a faculty position, perhaps at a postdoc level, what are the best mechanisms for promoting underrepresented minorities to enter a career in science? And I'll add to that, sort of moving further up along the promotion ladder. So maybe Rebecca, you want to answer this one for us?
Sure. One thing I didn't add in my introduction was that I was the first female chief scientist at any museum in Australia. and by the time I was appointed, the Australian Museum was 188 years old. So that's an example of a long time to change. Obviously, I'm a Western scientist, but I was the first woman. So there is nothing like seeing the example so that you can learn that you could be the example. If someone that comes before you doesn't look like you, then there's less likely that you're going to connect with that. And by the time I was leaving the Australian Museum, I had people saying to me they had only been at the museum when I was the director of science there, and they didn't realise that was unusual. So it shows that things can change quite quickly. I think Amanda's point is really powerful, that it's about connecting on a message. It's about, I think if we could all go and, there's plenty of places in Australia where we would all pay to have a sequencer, but people aren't really going to see what the value is for them. And that's certainly going to be the case where you say here in the United States, there are places that you know, they're more worried about water or fire than sequencer at the moment. And certainly if electricity is a limiting factor for you, you're probably not going to be so interested in a sequencer. So really the point is, like, what is the message that you can connect with people on? And that's how you bring people on board. And Amanda's presentation was pretty amazing to see how she enthuses young people through her science communication. And I guess I would be speaking to the senior genomics community who are out there listening and putting heaps of great questions in the chat. The people on this panel are the people that you want on your committees. The people on this panel, this generation, are the people that you want to be your collaborators, because they bring a different perspective to the way that they do science. They come with a different lived experience, and it is going to increase the diversity, and that is how we change the pipeline, by bringing more people along so that they feel supported. Certainly for me, as the first ever woman to do my job in Australia, I sounded completely different to people that went before me. My style was not at all like my predecessors, which could be perceived as either weakness, it could be perceived as not being confident enough, just because I sounded different and I looked different. And the more that we understand that many different people have a really different way of communicating their message, but it is of the same value, that the more that we start to understand that even if you sound different, you have a lot to bring to the table. There's probably many of you that can relate to people not taking you seriously for a really long time, and finally realizing that you have value to add, and inviting you to be part of a community. I think that's the conversation that we can have here, and it is potentially uncomfortable because it does mean doing things differently. And maybe, you know, at Natural History here in DC, some of our early career scientists have started doing programming in Spanish, which is just fantastic. It's just a brilliant way of realizing that there's a whole different community that our early career scientists are trying to connect with. And it's that kind of thing that we, as the senior members of the genomics community, can support in every aspect of our institution, but particularly I think the presentations today have been a brilliant example of how genomics can benefit from the perspectives on this panel.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I'd like to put a thought there to see what all of you think. So as I pointed, I think that inequalities are in society, so not only in science, but then they make different communities to reach science, like some to be privileged to be able to be educated in science. And then when we do have underrepresented minorities as scientists, and then we talk about these topics, it is important to be there because they are underrepresented and they are fighting the stereotypes and planting this good seed, right, of information to, as Rebecca said, to bring different perspectives and also to enrich the conversation, and then for people to see them. I mean, you need to have representatives to be represented, and also to encourage other people to be there. So yeah, so we are almost ending our session. So we have a statement here by Eric saying, I think the only solution to successfully sequencing genomes all species on the planet is involving all diverse populations of humans. What each of you think about it? Thoughts? Let's start with Rebecca, please.
Sorry, Marcella, I was just reading the questions. Can you ask me that again?
Right, of course. So this is a statement by Eric thinking, I think the only solution to successfully sequence all genomes for all species on the planet is involving all diverse populations of humans. Thoughts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think we've seen the different perspectives that come from involving just this small number of people on this panel who have lived experience that's different to our own. And that's a great thing for science, and it's a great thing for the genomics community.
Amanda?
Well, of course, I totally agree. I don't have a direct experience with this genomic sequencing, this kind of you are talking, but of course, with inside my experience, we can see that including these people, and as you said, giving like different examples of diversity. I have more experience with with women scientists as an example, to include more girls, for example, inside the science. So I think, of course, I totally agree with this statement.
Annette, your thoughts?
Yeah, I also totally agree that it is important to include diverse voices when trying to sequence all of the diversity in the world. I also think of the wealth of knowledge that people bring on board when they are included in the program, instead of imposing, like, we want to do this, it's important for X, Y, and Z, but yes, we want to do this, and we want you to be involved and actually contribute your knowledge and experiences in the project. So yes, I think it's a very good idea.
Levi?
Yeah, I'd say I definitely agree with that statement. Beyond that is even thinking retrospectively to all those genomes that have been sequenced, coming back and actually, as that research progresses, bringing in all the people that probably should have been involved from the get-go. Mm-hmm. But yeah, definitely agree with that statement.
Thank God.
Yeah, I think I agree with the statement, and I also identify with it because it's also similar to the points I made earlier, that I think from this point, we need to begin to look at it from the community side of things. And first of all, I understand that there are some taxonomic communities that, for instance, the expertise is not yet there. So, but there are also other communities where the expertise is there, but perhaps because the models, the systems they are working on is not model systems. And I think for me also, so this is area, I think this is the next stage we need to start going into in the attempt to sequence all life on Earth. Thank you.
Right. Guys, I have to say that there are people in the Q&A forum saying that they would like to follow up with all of you. So please, we have tweets around with all of our panelists' tweets. And please write Sadie and I, if you want more information. I think it would be excellent if we kept this conversation going. I would like to thank you all. I would like to ask if someone here from these panelists think that there is something that wasn't discussed. I mean, the challenges are very big and that we should put it out there. Any final statements that you would like to point out? Sadie, also.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely so many questions that we didn't have an opportunity within this hour. We didn't talk, for example, about sample collection and the challenges around that. We didn't talk about really about data publication and dissemination. So when we're thinking about the publication world, I think Levi mentioned it briefly. And there was also a really excellent question on people with disabilities. With my background in physiotherapy, it's something I think about both for the people and sort of just access. And so I think that's another facet of this that will require much longer, lengthier conversations, as well as involving a larger part of the community.
Yeah, agreed completely.
So.
So apart from our panelists, Annette, Thank God, Amanda, Levi, and Rebecca, I would like to also thank you, the Biodiversity Genomics meeting organizers from the Darwin Tree of Life, Vertebrate Genomes Project, Earth Biogenome Project, and the GIGA, for inviting us to host this conversation on diversity and inclusion. And as your co-chair, I also thank you, the meeting attendees, for being here and for your enthusiasm and humility in waiting to be part of this change. So please, let's keep this conversation on Twitter, and I give it to Sadie.
Yeah, and we do. We sincerely hope that you'll join us. We recognize an hour just can't even begin to scratch the surface, but we're so thankful for the opportunity to be here, that you're wanting to be here, and that we're all just willing to want to be a part of this conversation and to take action. And as you've heard from our panelists, thinking globally is really going to be about commitment and action at the local level. So from microscopic to macroscopic. And so with that, we want to wish you an enjoyable conference as you continue to reflect on these things and how we as a community can dismantle these inequalities that hinder progress, both in our science and as a human race, so that the future of genomics can really, truly be a genomics for all. Obrigado, gracias, thank you.
Obrigada, bye.